And our last speaker is Salman Abu Sitta, who is the founder and president of Palestine Land Society in London, which is dedicated to documentation of Palestine's land and people. He's the author of 6 books on Palestine, including the Compendium Atlas of Palestine 1917 to 1966, the Atlas of the Return Journey, which is over there on the table, and over 300 papers and articles on the Palestinian refugees, the right of return, and you've all received, I think, one of his famous maps that you have distributed. Salman will be speaking about demography of return for Palestinian refugees.
Good evening, everybody. It has been a long day for everybody. A long day for me, too. I'm the last speaker. And to add to this, it's now, according to my watch, it's my bedtime, past my bedtime. So I hope to be able to continue. But I will continue even if I run over time, because we are late anyway. Where is Debbie? Without Debbie here and without some of my friends, I would think I am in a different conference. I thought I would be speaking about future scenarios. And how can you speak about future scenarios without talking about the right of return? My case is very simple and clear. I am Palestinian, and I am robbed of my home by force. I'm determined to get it back. Very simple. This is the main and the only issue for me. There is no philosophy about it. There is no political massage. And I tell you, the emperor has no clothes. So you have to take that fact into account. As you know, any conflict resolution rests on 2 pillars. One of them is truth, to know all the facts about the situation. And the other one is justice, by which the law is applied to solve the conflict. None of the 2 are applied in the case of Palestine. And I have much reservation in calling it a conflict. It is really something else. But there is no colonial project which has been beset with so much falsification and deliberate misinformation like the case of Palestine. Ponder these titles: Land Without People, God Given Us the Land, UN decreed national home, and Britain did, Palestinian refugees left on their own accord, and so on. It really boggles the mind in this age of electronics that we cannot comprehend these simple facts. That is one reason why justice is not applied in the case of Palestine for 70 years now. The right of return has been affirmed 130 times, longer, and the most outstanding resolution in UN history. So let us go back to the origin for a little bit, origin of the conflict. Here is Palestine in 1917, and during the British Mandate, with their collusion after the infamous Balfour Declaration, they were able, Zionists were able to control 7% of the land of Palestine, which is seen here in blue. The partition plan suggested they get 55% of Palestine for new immigrants coming, some of them in smuggler ships to the country. And in that blue area, which is 55%, half the population there were Palestinians. And they lived in 476 towns and villages. Suddenly, they found themselves under the sovereignty of these new immigrants. But that was not enough, because then the Zionists occupied 78% of Palestine, 25% more of that. Now, here we have to examine what happened in this period. The partition plan, which is often touted as being the legal thread by which Israel was founded, has no legal meaning. It's not binding. It was only a suggestion. But the United Nations in March 1948 dropped the plan, and so did the US. And they instead suggested UN trusteeship. I don't think much of the Zionist propaganda here tells you that it has been dropped. And in the middle of March 1948, when it was dropped, Ben-Gurion was mad, because he was planning to take over Palestine under the pretext of the partition plan. So what he did, he started Plan Dalet. From 1st of April 1948 till 15th of May, when the State of Israel was declared, this situation depicts that period. You see, all the red areas have been occupied by some of the 9 brigades, Alexandria, Roni, and Kiryati, and so on. These red areas have been occupied in that period. And all the blue dots you see are Palestinian villages who have been depopulated. A total of 220 villages depopulated in these 6 weeks, and the people there comprise half of the total refugees today. And to do that was not easy, so there has to be massacres. And of course, Deir Yassin on the right side of the picture is one of them, and there are others there. So here you see in this period, and that was while the British were there, supposed to be protecting the population of Palestine. And that was before Israel was declared at all as a state. And that was before any Arab regular soldier entered Palestine. And so we have a situation here when the partition plan has been dropped and the ethnic cleansing has taken place on the largest scale possible. And this could not happen except, of course, in series of military operations, 31 military operations. This is the situation here when the Israel was declared 15th of May. They occupied only 13% of Palestine, and because they were heavily populated, that represented 50% of all refugees today. And then in the next 6 months, they occupied the rest of what's called Israel today in 31 military operations. So this fact is to be taken into account. One of the things we don't know, how to analyze the period altogether in this period. This shows you the population of the villages depopulated until 15th May 1948. What do you see there? You see in the total number there, it represents the total number, half of the all refugees. But after that, the military operations continued, and at the bottom you see the villages which have been depopulated. These red dots indicates the massacres which have taken in that time. The blue areas are the military operations, 31 military operations. And the yellow area is the truce, the first and second truce. What do you notice about this? You notice something startling. First of all, when the truce was there, nobody left, and the population who left stayed there. And when the truce ended, they started expelling population, and then during the second truce, nobody. So the expulsion of people was associated exactly with the number of incidents of massacres and military operations of Israel. So the myth that Palestinians left on their own or in Arab orders is a big lie. And I'm surprised that with so many scholars, they have not explained this simple case. And of course, here we have the case of Tantura. They were taken, the civilians were taken to dig trenches, and they were thrown in the trenches, and they were shot dead. And those surviving, like this case in Ramla in July 1948, they were taken to concentration camps and put into forced labor camps for almost 1 or 2 years. And the labor camps, which have been, I have interviewed so many people who have been there. So the red dots are the ones visited by the Red Cross, and we published that anyway. And the black dots are another 17 concentration camps, which have been described by the survivors and located in these places. So here we have what we call a Nakba. All the red dots you have are villages, Palestinian villages, which were populated for thousands of years, and then they were depopulated, and so Palestine became empty in fulfillment of the old myth that Palestine is a land without people. They made it so by force. And then what happened to those people? They became refugees in what's left in Palestine and in the neighboring countries. So this is what we call a Nakba. But a Nakba is not a traffic accident. It is continuing until today. Here is Gaza. These red dots are the villages which have been depopulated from half of Palestine, and they were put in 8 refugee camps. But there is something to tell you more about that. The villages in southern Palestine, 247, they were completely ethnic cleansed, unlike in Galilee, some have been left. And they were completely ethnically cleansed with massacres in Bureir and in other places. Now, all those people in half of southern half of Palestine, 50%, have been put into large concentration camp called Gaza Strip with an area of 1.3%. So people who lived in 50% of Palestine are now pushed into 1.3% of Palestine. Not only that, as I will show, their land, which they are now, this minute, we are talking about today, the Friday, the young people are saying, my land is there, I cannot go there. All the settlers in the southern Palestine, the home of those people, do not exceed, in my estimation, at least 2018, more than 72,000 settlers. And they are less than 1 refugee camp in Gaza. In other words, if those settlers in southern Palestine go away, or we can put them in a refugee camp, they will not occupy more than 1 single refugee camp in Gaza. That doesn't say, of course, about the 3 Palestinian villages, towns, Beersheba, Majd al-Asqalan, and Isdud, who have 150,000 and more. Anyway, so the people in Gaza have been suffering, expelled in 1948, and they are bombed in their exile, 2014, and they are killed on the barbed wire today. That is what we call a Nakba. Now, this situation cannot last, so we have to reverse the war crime of perpetual ethnic cleansing. How do we do that? Of course, we have bags, piles of UN resolutions, and every article of international law says they should go. I don't need to repeat. You are all scholars. You can just click on the website and you find hundreds and hundreds of UN resolutions saying Palestinian refugees should return home. And that is not a favor. This is a principle of international law. All the treaties using that are actually applying that principle rather than creating that right. So to do that, we have to think of Palestine, its land and its people, and the law applicable in this case. The land Luckily for Palestine, during the British mandate and before that the Ottomans and the United Nations, we have complete record of ownership of the land in Palestine. I have, and in Palestine Land Society, 500,000 records of individual names and where they own. So we have no problem with that. The people will talk about that in a minute, but the law, we have, a regime of international law which is ready for application, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the covenants against racism and so on, and also self-determination and 181 and 194 and so on. But let us talk about the people, because the land is sitting there. We know who owns it. We know they are refugees, but we know who owns it. And the law is there. Now let us talk about the people. If we talk about the people, my figures here about 2008, but it applies. You will find inside Palestine today, the blue column is the Jews, but the top tranche is 300,000 of foreign workers. The bottom one, below that, is 1 million Russians, and the rest are Ashkenazis and Mizrahi, okay? With them, at that time, the Palestinians are about 4.5 million. Now they are more than that. But you see the black dots on the red. These are refugees of those. So more than half of them are refugees. But out of now today, Palestinians are 13 million, and half of them are outside Palestine. Look at the column on the right, outside Palestine. The absolute majority of them are refugees. Now, okay, so let us look at Palestine today. I'm talking about Palestine, which is called Israel. And let us examine who lives in the land of those refugees today. We know who lives there. We know where they came from, and we analyze that in detail. I'll show you a result of that. Palestine, during the mandate, has been divided administratively into 1,100 towns and villages. Each one of them has a town or village or more, and it has an area belonging to that village. So we call this village land. Village land is different from the village itself. Village land like that. So we examined how many people living there from the Israel Statistics Bureau, and we found that all the green areas have today no Jews or Jews less than 5,000. Almost 472 villages have practically no Jews, or absolutely zero Jews, or Jews less than 5,000 in each of them. And the documentation is available for someone there. So then the next step will be to see where is the land of the Jews. It is the same like I showed you earlier. That's the land they owned during the British Mandate. And they lived mostly on that land with a little spillover. We'll explain that. Here, for example, we have the cities. The cities are, especially the coastal cities, are mixed population. So the brown area indicate the land of the cities. Cities have a different treatment. But then, where are the Jews occupying the land of Palestinians with a large majority? They occupy the Palestinian land with a large majority, over 30,000, in the dotted areas. You see the dotted here, few of them in the south and the north. Only in that area. The Jews today are majority over the absent Palestinians. Now, next step will be to see in terms of size, proportion size, where do the Jews live? You can see easily where do they live. In Tel Aviv area, and in Jerusalem to the east, and in HAIFA. The three dots at the bottom, big ones I told you about earlier, they are Asdod and Al-Majd al-Asqalan and Beersheba. But most of the Jews live in Tel Aviv area, of course absorbing Jaffa, and about a dozen villages there, and same in Jerusalem West and in HAIFA. Now, we can then say to Palestinians, you can return. The red dots are Palestinian villages. They can return. They will all go to the green area. where there is nobody there or very few people who are there. There is no obstruction to the Palestinian refugees returning in the structure of today. I'm talking here about villages, rural villages. I'm excluding, of course, cities, which have a different kind of treatment. We'll come to that in a minute. So actually, this is not a new invention. It's probably obscured from literature, deliberately or otherwise, by the Israelis. This map, this table, is done by Israel 2020. A big plan started in 1995 saying what Israel would look like in 2020. It's an Israeli document which shows that 88% of the land in Israel today is controlled by the army and the kibbutz but the population centers here are less than 8% in 2020, and they are 5% in 1994. Spaces and centers. And the military, of course, occupies all that. So here we have what you all know, but you are afraid to say, Israel is a military base, basically with people in it. It's a huge military base. It's the largest military base from Paris to Peking. That's a fact. Now, we then should say, let us look again at Palestinian villages, and we see that these are Palestinian villages populated. The green section of the village are people who found refuge in Gaza, and the brown section of the circle are people who found refuge in West Bank and Jordan. So we can send them back to their villages. They don't need ships or airplanes. They can actually walk. It's within bus ride. We can repeat the same experiment for Galilee. And here there are already, in the purple dots, there are Palestinians already there. And if we bring the refugees back, they will add only a small thing. Half the population in Galilee is Palestinian anyway, and those who come from Syria and Lebanon will hardly add to the whole picture. Now, this is the nice part, but the difficult part in the center, as I said before, around Tel Aviv and so on. What shall we do with that? Well, we can think. For example, we can create cantons. So we create canton Tel Aviv. I have added here in blue the settlement blocks of Jews today in Tel Aviv area. Now, I added also black areas. You can see them black, not here, shown here as being brown. I added this to connect the cantons. This canton actually contains a very large number, almost 3/4 of the Jews in Palestine, in Israel. And the rest of the areas, as I explained before, the dotted one are Jews living in Palestinian land, but the situation is much simpler. One thing I should add very quickly, that if you actually impose on that the built-up area today, the built-up area, the expansion, urban expansion today, it does not cover more than these areas. In other words, the urban expansion today, I have to finish. I'll make coup d'etat. So they still in this area. And I'll hurry. The canton number 2 is in HAIFA. It actually is the same, and we can bring the built-up area still on the same area. There is very few built-up area outside these cantons. Now, then we think of the villages. And here, this lovely scene, countryside scene from Google about what they call Israel idyllic or ideal countryside. This picture here conceals a war crime. Here, there is a grave of a village. This village is called Beit Jirja. It's destroyed. But the nature was on our side. You see, the texture of the landscape is still different because the debris of the building is still there. So what shall we do? Do we know Beit Jirja? Yes, we do. We scouted the world for aerial photographs and maps and so on, and we found Beit Jirja. Here's Beit Jirja. The green areas are the number of houses, and we know the names of the owners of these houses. We have a list of them and all of them. So we can then start thinking of how we can do the return journey for the refugees. Now, on the right side, the exile locations, exile camps, and on the right side, the villages. When we select one camp, this one is in Al-Bas in Lebanon, we know we know the people of that camp, where they come from. They come from the red villages here, and the road leading to that. We can do another example, refugees in camp, Mizdar in Jordan. Here is the camp, here is the camp, and then we have these villages on the right side where people live there. I mean, they come from there, and then we actually created road system where you can go from the village, from the exile camp to the village, using the modern road system today. And average distance is no more than 60 kilometers, maximum 150 kilometers, and so on. We have another example for a camp in Gaza, Nusayrat camp. Here is the camp, and here are the villages where they come from, and we can lead them to go home. Okay, but they will go home to a deserted place, demolished houses, so we have to think of how we can rebuild these houses. The staging of the return is very straightforward. For example, out of 4.6 million, when the refugees from Gaza return, the number of refugees dropped to half. And then from Jordan, they dropped by 1 million. So actually, it can be done in about 4, 5, 6 stages in about 6 years, and it will be that. Now, we will bring them back to a deserted place. We have to see how we can house them in their location. This is Tantura, with the massacre of Tantura. We actually digitized the aerial photographs. We created a complete map of the village, and with names of houses and so on. This took 5 years at least, but now we have 10,000 files on all the villages. We know what they are like. We know the people there. We know who owned them. We know which refugee camp they live in. We know the road from the refugee camp to this. But then we did something else. We have to see what is the situation today in that village, in Tantura. Yes, 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 coming close. So this is the location. Now we need to build that, rebuild the destroyed. So we made a plan with Palestinian universities that the graduating class of architecture, each one should select a village and had to give a graduation project of reconstructing his village. And this is one example of the winning design in London last year. One student designed Tantura again. We have a jury for this, and the jury distinguished architects from Germany, England, and Ireland, and Arab countries. And this year, we have 8 universities participating, not only in Palestine, but also in Jordan too, and the American University of Beirut. And next year, year 3, the competition will be among all universities in the world who would like to do that. Second example of Colonia in Jerusalem district. Here is the village, and here is the old village. We digitize it, as you can see in the red lines, and then we see what the location today of the village. That's the location of today. Then the young engineers, young architects, Palestinians, designed the new village in this way. This is a winning design, right? And then last one from HIRIBYA, Gaza district. This is the location, and here is the village of HIRIBYA, and it was redigitized, and then its location is empty, as you can see. So the winning design for HIRIBYA is this one, right? Now, we actually have to examine the costs of construction. These are the stages of construction. How many people are labor required? How much cost is that? And the phases of that, number of villages in each case. And by the way, we find easy. I mean, I don't know. To me, it was startling, but when you think of it, it's not really very strange. And that is the cost of reconstruction villages is less than or equal to the aid given by the United States to Israel in 1 year, not in 70 years, in 1 year. And Palestinians really don't really need that because they can build themselves these. Only they are allowed to return to their homes, and they can do that themselves. Let me conclude. I'm concluding. Now, let us consider the facts. These are all facts, of course, but let us consider the facts about Israelis first. Fact number one, Israel occupied all of Palestine by military force. And there is no legal justification whatsoever. And there are no borders. And there is a pile of UN resolutions against that, number one. Fact two, Israel enjoys unlimited support of the United Nations and the variable support of some Western countries. Fact three, Israel is an important weapons and cyber products exporter. Economically, it's very robust. Half of the Israeli companies are listed in New York Stock Exchange. The bond between Israeli economy and the European countries and the United States largely reflects the Jewish power in these countries. So no doubt about that. But actually, according to an extensive study which I mentioned earlier called Israel 2020, there will not be in Israel, there should not be in Israel, they say, Israeli study says, in Israel more than 8 million people, million Jews anywhere. Why? Because there are many reasons listed in 3 big volumes on that, because they wanted them to be in Europe and America, better for Israel. So they don't plan that. There is also a constant flow of Jews leaving Israel. As you know, 750,000 are said to be living abroad. We hear about 70,000 people applying for their German citizenship. But are they abandoning ship? No, I don't think they are abandoning ship. But that means the status quo is not stable. Now, let us look at the facts about Palestinians. I'll finish. They were 1.5 million in 1948. Now they are 13 million. In year 2030, Palestinians will be 18 million. Half of them on Palestine soil, and the other half are on the borders within 100 miles of the border of Palestine. They have no tanks, I'm sure. They have no airplanes. And in Palestine, they are either second-class citizens. We have described that. But many Arab regimes today abandon them. Of course, good old friend Trump and cohorts entered the scene as a bull in a china shop, and they destroyed international law. It doesn't look very pretty. But, here is the but. They have been in constant state of struggle for 100 years since the infamous Balfour Declaration. And they stood their ground for 6 major wars and hundreds of air, sea, and land Israeli attacks, mostly in refugee camps, if you notice all of them on that. They foiled 50 or 60 Western and Israeli so-called peace plans since 1949. All these plans are aimed to do one thing: let us resettle the Palestinians anywhere in the world except in their countries. But they have 170 UN members on their side, and the growing number of young people in the West actually on their side. And the third generation of refugees know where they come from. And now they are camping on the armistice line, watching their land this Friday and every Friday until as much as possible. So Ben-Gurion is wrong when he said the young will forget. They did not. But in the last 100 years, I want to remind you, more of you as scholars, I would like anyone to challenge me on this point. Not one oppressive regime survived in the last 100 years. Nazism, fascism, formal communism, European colonialism in all Asia, in all Africa, institutionalized discrimination, apartheid, all gone, except in Israel. And there are no moral or legal or geographic or demographic or economic or logistic reason why Palestinians cannot return. But the Israel racist and apartheid policy, and it must be abolished. And this is the job of every person in the world who have good conscience. Let us abolish that. Thank you very much.